Okay, let's get this quad in the air, stress test this board a little bit. So, to be clear, I don't think this is actually the way that I would necessarily fly this board, but I think this is a good quad to push the board. So, this is a 3S build with the 1203 flywheel motors. I forget what the KB is exactly, but you can see there's no shortage of power on this. And I've got this on the GemFan 3016s, the tri-blades. So specifically, the tri-blades take a little bit of the top end off of it. And I'm doing that intentionally because you can see how easily this thing just gets past my yard and any of the space I have here. So this is also a good day to, I think, test the thermal capability of the board, thermal handling or whatnot, because it's hot. I think it should be over 100 degrees by now. So these motors, even without a whole lot of like heat going into them or a lot of noise going into them, they're going to run fairly warm, not hot. So it's still very much, you can put your finger and hold it on it, but it will be warm. But that should be enough to really, to really stress the board. I'm flying this on a 3S 530, and you can see with being kind of aggressive, I'm going to dump this battery out in probably less than 5 minutes, probably around a 4-minute flight. So this is a little bit harder to talk through than some of my normal flights because it's a little bit more intense in terms of the speed. I got to be more careful. If I let this quad get away from me, this will smash a neighbor's house and make a pretty big thunk. So I'm trying to be mindful of not doing that. This quad is flyable. Let me see if I can get in there. You know, in terms of tight stuff. Ish. So flyable-ish in terms of the tight stuff. It just carries more and has more power. So unless I'm flying this very regularly, it's definitely a little bit harder to get in there. You know, on the 1S build, on the 3-inch, or on that little 2-inch build, you know, you've got enough room for air. This board, on the other hand, or this build, I should say, there's just not that room for air. The tune on it's pretty good. Just tri-blades. You know, I'm gonna take a look at it. There has been, and I don't know, it's always hard to know, is it going to be from the VTX or is it going to be from the board? But there's a fair bit of electrical noise in the VTX. So you can see in the VTX, you can see kind of a bunch of like little, you know, lines and stuff on it. And I have found that that's true when I was flying this on 1S and when I was flying it on this build with the 3S. The VTX on here, you know, as far as the micro VTXs go, or nano VTXs go, it's one of the better ones, supposedly. It's the Eachine, it's the V2. And I've had some good results with it, but on this particular one, I don't know if it's the board or the VTX, but could also be like the antenna. There's a bunch of different reasons that you might not get the signal that you're hoping for. But look at that temperature. So 65, it's just staying there. This is like over 100 degrees, and this battery's about dumped out, and so that's a 530. Still got a little bit left, but about 4 minutes. So we put a lot through this board. This is a 1 to 3S board, and you know, temperature-wise, it's fine. So let me pull this in. We'll go to the bench, talk a little bit more. Let's talk about this Darwin board just a little bit more. So If you're not familiar with this board, this is kind of an interesting one because it is a 1 to 3S board. ESCs I think are like 15 amp ESCs, and it has Express ELRS built right into it via SPI. So I feel like I have like pretty close to enough to call this a review, but I'm going to hold off on that until we get to the final release of Betaflight 4.3. The reason for that is because we've got some weirdness going on in terms of that SPI implementation. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, kind of want to just go over, I think, some of the other things first, and we'll talk about that SPI stuff at the end. So with this Darwin board, this is the quad I was stress testing it on. So these are the Flywoo 1203 motors. They're a 5500 kV motor, and I had these GemFan 3016s on there. And I was flying it with this GNB 530 milliamp battery. It's a 3S. And so my all-up weight there is 90 grams. And I was flying it on nice hot days. And I've flown it a lot with actually these motors. So these are the 1S version. Again, the 1203 Flywoos, but in a higher kV for 1S. So I have flown this Darwin board quite a bit on 1S, and then more recently I've flown it on the 3S to kind of really try and stress test it and see if it pops or not. And I don't have a ton of batteries. I think I've got like 5 or 6 full packs through it, and it's held up fine, and that includes, you know, flying in these kind of ridiculous temperatures we had today. So that was good to see. So to me, that's pretty impressive. Any board that can go from 1S to 3S and do fine in both there's something to be said for that. Also, in terms of building up this board, I actually like building on it. You've got pretty nice ability to solder the motors on, so the motor pads are pretty decent right there. You can see there's reasonable space, not that hard. And the rest of the board, in terms of soldering to it, it's pretty well laid out. It's nicely spaced out. You get much more room than some of the other boards that I've used, like the GemQ 16x16 board. So building it was kind of nice. Plus, with the Express LRS built in there, that's 4 wires you don't have to solder. So that's kind of a nice little bonus of having that built in. Now, in terms of like integrating, so some boards integrate the receiver. Some boards have gone down the route of integrating the VTX. And for me, I do like the idea of doing the receiver better than the VTX, mainly because temperature. So on some of these boards where they have the VTX built in, I get temperature problems during the summer and I just can't fly them because they overheat. With the VTX being separate, that's just, you know, not an issue. And even when I'm flying 3S, putting a ton of power through the board, the temperature stays fine. So those are the good things about the board. So now, downsides. Because this board is so versatile, so it goes from 1 to 3S, it's a little bit unfocused. So, for example, if you're building 1S, I don't think that this is at all in any way the receiver antenna you want to throw on this. So this is kind of that you know, mini Immortal T kind of style antenna, and this it's huge, weighs a lot, so you're probably not going to do that. What I did is I sort of split the difference between that and something else by going ahead and just using so what I did is I actually took a VTX antenna and just stripped off the insulation and cut it down to length, and you can see it pops on with a UFL. I do like that it's the bigger size rather than the tiny IPEX. Those tiny IPEX ones, I find that they don't stay on very well, and then you bend them, and then you got to like desolder them and direct solder, and that's kind of a mess. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to have a separate antenna, I do like the UFL, but the main problem is that nobody's got those cube antennas on a UFL, and so you got to do something like I did here, which works fine. But at the end of the day, I think if you're flying on 1S, then you certainly would probably just want to do the cube and be done with it. Now, with that said, because this can go up to 3S, maybe you know, obviously on this build, this antenna weight's really not going to make much of a difference, and so I could throw it on there, and other than being kind of like, you know, what do you do with it? Where do you mount it up? You know, do you put it on an arm or wherever? It's the weight's not a factor, but on 1S I think it is. Especially if you're not doing a 3-inch prop. So, there's no reason you have to do this build on 3-inch props. So the other part too is if you're on 1S, you're throwing a capacitor on here, where most 1S boards, you're not throwing a capacitor on. So I think if you start looking at the all-up weight, once you're throwing the capacitor on there, even though the board itself isn't that heavy, I think once you start totaling up the weight, it starts to get a little bit on the heavy side. So other things, one of the other things I had on this board is I'm not getting the best video out of it. So I used the brand new, this is a new, this is one of these amp light cameras. And then the VTX, so this is the Eachine Nano, and it's that V2 that's got the little built-in microphone. That Eachine Nano is, supposedly a pretty decent little VTX, but I just haven't been getting very good video out of this particular quad. Now, I haven't gone and tried to isolate the problem, so it may not be the board. It very well may be from the camera, very well may be from the VTX, but it could be coming from the board. It could also be coming from the Rubicon capacitor. So this is a 16 volt, I think 220 UF capacitor. On my builds, when I'm building them up with parts that I'm hand picking, I use an FR capacitor. And on a 3S, yes, I would do 16 volt. And I'd probably do a 220. It's usually enough, but it could be an issue of the capacitor. But at the end of the day, I don't know if it's from the board. And maybe it's just the other components that are giving me the poor video quality. So now let's get to the weirdness, and the reason I'm holding off on this. So with Express LRS built in, it's one of the things that we have is just that on the little F411 board, you're not going to have as much CPU processing power. And so you're going to have to make some decisions. And in this case, I am flying this on I think 8K, 2K, and I'm using RPM filtering. And so the decisions you have to make is if you want to keep RPM filtering and use Express LRS at 500 hertz, then you've got to drop it from 8K, 4K down to 8K, 2K. Or if you want to keep it at like 8K, 8K, then you have to do something else, like you have to drop your RPM filtering in your dynamic idle and not load up the CPU that way. So there's some choices you have to make, and I'm not that opposed to those but where to me it doesn't really make sense is when I'm flying on a quad this big, I'm flying on an all-up 90 gram all-up weight quad, I don't want to make that trade-off. I don't mind a tiny bit of extra weight in the flight controller to have an external, or a UART version of a built-in Express LRS, and I don't want to have to make those decisions or throw an F411 processor on there to do some. Now, granted, cost is a factor, and one of the things you're doing here with the Darwin board is you're keeping costs down, so fair enough, but me personally, I think I'd rather not have to make those compromises. Where I'm willing to make those compromises would be if I went ahead, for example, and am building up a little 2-inch quad or a Whoop, and I'm using something more like the Happy Model Diamond board where I'm saving every little gram. I think that makes a ton of sense. So now, with those things aside, so if you can live with that, if you can live with making some compromises, saying, okay, I'm fine with not having my 8K, 4K with RPM filter, I'm fine cutting something down. The part where this gets weird is, I think, in the pin management, so the pin mapping, that's on the processor. So when you flash this board, you're flashing the beta FPV target. And my understanding is they made kind of a mess of the pin assignments on that beta FPV board. And so if the DarwinFPV, if they basically used those same pin assignments, then you inherited all the problems that beta FPV created. And where that shows up on this particular quad is that if you want to use smart audio, then you cannot use D-Shot bitbang. I'm not 100% sure how important D-Shot bitbang is and whether it's fine to just turn it off. But I get a little worried if Betaflight 4.3 is designed to use that, and then now you're turning it off, and then when you're problem solving, so for example, if you have a quad that's not flying well, is it because you turned off D-Shot Bit Bang and it's thrown something off and creating problems that way? So that's kind of where I am waiting to see the final release candidate and see if DarwinFPV comes up with any new software or whatever for this, because and new hex for it, because as it stands right now, you're going to end up with some weird stuff. If you just try and set this board up, it's not as straightforward. Okay, apparently this board handles the heat better than my camera does. I just had my camera went out on me with the heat. It really is that hot out. But anyway, so point being is I'm going to wait for Betaflight 4.3 to be finalized before kind of making a determination whether I think it's overly problematic in terms of, you know, whether they sort out this bit bang thing or they set that up for you in the preset, you know, when you download the custom presets when you're loading Betaflight, whether they sort that out for you. But overall, at the end of the day, it's a unique board. It does go 1S to 3S. The benefits of that are you can build anything up from like a 1S quad to a 3S quad, and that's nice. The main downsides of that are it's just a little, it lacks a little bit of focus. It could do 3S a little better, could do 1S a little bit better, but is what it is. Biggest gripe is really the SPI Express LRS. I'd really like to see that via UART, especially on a board at this size that can do 3S. But it's unique. Price is reasonable. I like the way it's laid out. I like building with it. I think overall it's worth checking out, but you got to be aware of these quirks that it does have and make sure that you're okay with them, because I don't know if those quirks are all going to be undoable. I think some of them are kind of baked into the way this board is built. All right, till next time, cheers.